Okay, good afternoon and welcome everybody. Today I'll be giving a speech on Ronald Reagan. As someone who has studied presidential history for several years, I've always been interested in a number of presidents who have shaped the course of history, who have shaped America, and who have made significant contributions to society. And today I'll be talking about my personal idol, President Reagan. Now, most of you have probably heard of him before, but you may not be familiar with the details and his career. So I'll be talking about that today. So Ronald Reagan actually had a long, fascinating career in a number of fields. He was a TV personality, a movie actor. He enlisted in the United States military, the Army Reserve, and the Air Force. And he also developed an interest for politics over the next period of years, particularly because of a number of military and economic crises, from the Cold War, the Vietnam War, and inflation. And Reagan was very well known for his courage, his optimism, his resilience, his willingness to just keep pushing forward and basically never believing in the idea that we just have to accept the problems we face. He firmly believed that we can do something about it, and this is ultimately how he ended up in the world of politics later on. So most of you who know about Reagan and his presidency may also know that he was elected in a landslide, both in 1980 and in 1984. What some of you may not know, however, is that this was not the first time he ran for president. The first time he ran for president was in 1976. Back then it was Gerald Ford, the incumbent Republican, versus Democrat Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter actually won the race that year. The reason why Reagan got involved and joined the race was because he had major disagreements with President Ford, primarily on policy issues with respect to the economy and national security. And Reagan was very dissatisfied with Ford's handling of these issues, which is why he believed the tensions, primarily in the Cold War, got worse. However, the choice of the majority was Gerald Ford. He won the nomination, and later on, though, when Reagan tried it again, he won in a landslide, as you can see on the right side. And then, as I mentioned before, in 1984. This really shows what perseverance is all about, and Reagan's willingness to just keep trying and never giving up. Because oftentimes the time is just not right. Sometimes you have to wait, try it again, and Reagan understood that very, very well. Reagan was always known as the great communicator. One of the major differences between Reagan and other politicians is that Reagan had the ability to use a sense of inspiration, optimism, and self-confidence whenever he was giving a speech, whenever he was delivering an address to the nation, both as governor of California and as President of the United States. Reagan always believed that the best way to get the message across is to make it sound credible, convincing, and he did so by using this sense of optimism and inspiration and also passion in his speeches. One of my favorite parts about Ronald Reagan is that he had a great sense of humor. And this is also what you need in times of crisis. Reagan was able to keep the mood bright, even when things seemed hopeless. For example, when it comes to the Cold War and the rising tensions between the United States, the Soviet Union, and the respective allies, Reagan always had a good joke to tell to the public. Some of them he even told to Soviet leader, General Secretary Gorbachev, and even he laughed. So Reagan showed strength against Soviet communism in many ways, including his great sense of humor. One of my favorite stories about his humor is when he was shot in 1981 and had to be sent to the hospital for surgery. He was able to keep the mood light, and he looked at the doctor and said, "I hope you're a Republican." The doctor was actually a Democrat, but he responded, "Today, Mr. President, we're all Republicans." So essentially it was that humor that showed people that Reagan is actually a tough fellow. And I think that was one of the transforming moments of his presidency. Reagan's management style mainly came from his time in Hollywood. He was the star, and it was up to the rest of the crew to keep the production running smoothly. Reagan had a unique management style. Now the key question is, what was Reagan's greatest contribution to society? Here's my view. Reagan understood that the key to peace was military and economic strength, to make us so strong that it will send a message to our adversaries that we seek peaceful avenues before resorting to the use of force. Reagan also knew that we must keep the Soviets in discussion while at the same time keeping continuous pressure on them, and that actually worked very well. Eventually the Soviets came to the realization that they could no longer compete with the United States and their military and economic strength. The Cold War reached a turning point when Reagan traveled to West Berlin, Germany, which is where I'm from, which is also where I live. And I have visited Berlin many, many times, a place full of history and culture. And when West Berlin was encircled by the Berlin Wall, Reagan traveled there in 1987 and basically set an exclamation point on his rhetorical war against Soviet communism. His famous line, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," became very famous, widespread, particularly after the collapse of the Berlin Wall 2 years later. And then 1 year later, the Soviet Union collapsed. One thing that is very remarkable about this story is that this daring statement was at first seen as plain, simple, just rhetoric, words that it would have no effect. but then it happened. And this shows what major contribution Reagan made to the free world. I believe that Reagan was one of the greatest presidents of all time, even though I was not born at the time when he was president, and I was only 7 years old when he died in 2004. But I have read so many stories, heard so much about him, and I firmly believe that we have to thank him for much of what he accomplished. Thank you very much, and have a great day.